The grand jurors didn't know who might have done what, but felt that there was something that happened there.
What they believed was that the parents knew what had happened or should have known what had happened or should have got her help and failed to do so. That's what one grand juror said to me.
What's going on, everyone? Welcome to the Behavioral Arts. My name is Spidey and I use my degree in sociology and psychology, my certifications in criminal interrogation and body language analysis, and over 10 years experience as an award-winning mentalist to teach people behavioral analysis and practical psychology on stages and television shows all over the world. This week, we are looking at the third and final episode of the recent Netflix docuseries all about the cold case of JonBenet Ramsey, one of the most mysterious and bizarre cases in all of US criminal history. Now, for those of you who are unfamiliar with the case, really quickly, JonBenet Ramsey was a 6-year-old beauty queen whose body was found in the basement of her home in Boulder, Colorado, 28 years ago, almost to the day. Now, due to the strange circumstances surrounding the discovery of her body and a very odd ransom letter that was found on site, the Boulder Police Department suspected that the parents had something to do with this, and the media ran with that. So at first, the public opinion seemed to be that the parents had some sort of involvement with this tragedy. Now, 28 years later, because of some evidence and some other investigators who got involved and some experts who shared their opinions, public opinion seems to be split. There are those who still believe that the parents were involved in this, and there are those who believe that they had nothing to do with it. In this video, we're looking at specifically the third episode of the Netflix docuseries, and there was a lot of really fascinating stuff here. And we're gonna look at some body language, facial expressions, word choice, and get a sense of what's going on with all these people. Let's take a look.
John and Patsy square off against former Boulder police detective Steve Thomas. Put together what you think happened that night.
A bedwetting or a toileting issue.
That caused Patsy to get mad at her daughter.
Absolutely.
Our child wet her bed and we slaughtered her. That is so preposterous.
You must have conjured something in your head for you to come out and call me a murderer of my child.
Patsy, I think
now I want to hear 1 through 10.
I think you heard.
When did I write
ransom
this
note.
ransom
You-
note? Before
you
or
tell
after
me if
I?
you wrote the ransom
No,
note.
you're the one theorizing here. You tell me.
You weren't there, John. You can't know.
I was there. I know Patsy.
you
I've
were
lived
there.
with her for 20 years.
Well, would you agree, Patsy, that almost none of it makes sense?
Right. It
None
was
of
an
it.
evil.
What was the guy doing? Why did the intruder do this?
man.
Evil person.
Okay, so those are some clips from the famous CNN interviewer Larry King talked to JonBenet's parents, John and Patsy Ramsey, as well as former detective Steve Thomas, who was one of the detectives who worked the case and was very convinced that Patsy was involved. In fact, he thought Patsy did this. So right in the beginning, as Patsy and John are being introduced, you'll notice that Patsy is sitting very straight up like this, her chin up, and if you look at her face, there's a very light scrunching around the nose. It looks kind of like this. Very, very faint. Now, this scrunching is very closely associated to negative experiences. Things like the universal facial expression of disgust or contempt involve scrunching around the nose and mouth. Whenever we're thinking about something unpleasant or even experiencing something unpleasant, our face shuts down for less input, so we see a lot of this scrunching, and we're seeing it there. Overall, she doesn't look very happy to be there, but her posture is suggesting that she's ready for a confrontation. Now, keep in mind that Patsy herself has experience in pageantry as well. So this kind of posture with the chin up like this, presenting herself to the cameras, is something that she's used to. But if we look at her husband, John, sitting next to her, at first, he's a little more slouched. But he sees her, I don't know if it's at the corner of his eye or if they're looking at a monitor. It's very likely that they're looking at a monitor in front of them. But the moment he notices that there's a bit of asymmetry, he straightens up and pretty much goes into the exact same position that she's in. So right off the beginning here, we're seeing a sense of togetherness, a synchronicity between the two. He's mirroring her posture, and in a lot of the interviews, even till today, there was a sense of togetherness where they kind of defended each other and presented one front. You'll notice as she's addressing Steve Thomas, her tone is very impatient, very snappy. She's coming out guns blazing, and we're seeing a lot of these chin thrusts as she's talking. So it's with her chin forward, leaning like this as she's talking. Now, we talk about chin thrusts a lot on the channel, and they're one of the signs to look for in pre-aggression. Before someone gets physically aggressive, this is one of the things we often see where they talk with the chin like this. It's a subconscious challenge or instigation. We're seeing it here, and her tone is matching that as well. There are two things in her word choice that jumped out at me. One is when she says, "You must have conjured something in your head to come out and call me a M-er." of my daughter. By the way, I'm sorry for all the censorship. The last video that I did was restricted for ad suitability, and I'm not sure what it is. I'm not sure which words or which topics, so I'm just trying to cover all my bases. But anyways, she says that you called me this, and she uses the actual term. She doesn't say, you know, you must have conjured something up for you to accuse me of hurting my daughter or doing something to my daughter, or she's not being vague about it. She's using that term in this moment of aggression.
You must have conjured something in your head for you to come out and call me a murderer of my child.
Patsy, I think
now
you
I
wrote
want to
the-
hear
I think you
1
wrote the
through
ransom.
10.
I think you.
And that's really interesting because in interrogation, we have something called psychological distancing. This is something we listen for where the person uses words to soften the act and distance from it. So say things like, I would never touch her, I would never hurt her, instead of using the heavier, more gruesome words, which she's using here. So with her, it's like she's psychologically approaching and saying, you're accusing me of actually doing this horrifying thing to my daughter. And I think she's using that word to really emphasize how horrible and how big this accusation is. She's not trying to run from it, she's going closer to it to highlight it. But in the next sentence, she says something that's subtle, but is a little bit of psychological distancing. And it's when she says, when did I write this ransom letter? So this is an interesting word choice there because when we speak in conversation, this tends to be dismissive of an idea, almost makes it hypothetical or questions the legitimacy of it. So for example, let's say you were to tell me that you have a picture of me from last week that's very compromising. I might say something, oh yeah, well, where is this picture? Right? Like, where's this hypothetical picture that you're talking about? Even think about the difference between saying, who's that guy and who's this guy? One is a little more curious, who's that guy? I don't know who that is. One's like, who's this guy? What is this guy? What is this guy doing here? So it almost has this dismissive component to it.
When did I
wrote the
write
ransom
this
note.
ransom
You-
note? Before
you
or
tell me
after
if
I
you wrote the ransom
No,
note.
you're the one theorizing.
So here when she's saying, when did I write this ransom note? It almost has a bit of a dismissive element to it. Like the ransom note may not be a real thing, but we know it's a real thing because we've seen it. Now, I'm not going to be too harsh on this because it's one isolated word choice and it's in a heated moment where she's being confrontational, so maybe it just came out that way, but it's still interesting that using this ransom note, when did I write it, kind of puts a bit of distance there, kind of mocks the whole idea of the ransom note. As an interesting comparison, notice how immediately after Steve Thomas says, you tell me, you wrote the ransom note, which makes a lot more sense that way, the ransom note, the one that we all know about, the one that we're talking about, and it's interesting to contrast that with the way she said, when did I write this ransom note?
When did I
wrote the
write
ransom
this
note.
ransom
You-
note? Before
you
or
tell me
after
if
I
you wrote the ransom
No,
note.
you're the one theorizing.
Another really interesting moment is when Larry says, do you agree, Patsy, that almost none of it makes sense? And this is a really, really good question from a very seasoned interviewer because he's just bringing up this vague question of like, there's a lot here that doesn't make sense. And she just goes, right. And then she goes on with the next thought, as opposed to stopping and talking about some of the things that truly don't make sense about this.
Well, would you agree, Patsy, that almost none of it makes sense?
Right. It
None
was
of
an
it.
evil.
What was the guy doing? Why did the
This is
intruder
a
do this?
man.
Evil person.
And this is an interesting opportunity for her to go, yeah, look, this doesn't make sense, that doesn't make sense, but it's almost like she doesn't want to comment on or draw attention to the things that don't make sense. So it really seems like she has no problem confronting the act itself, talking about it, using harsh terms, telling him, no, come on, give me the details, tell me what happened. But when we talk about this ransom note, and he's talking about how some of these elements don't make sense, she all of a sudden doesn't want those details, doesn't want to elaborate, and moves away from it. It's an interesting contrast in her behavior and how much importance she gives to different elements of this story. I want to jump in at this point with something that I often say in my videos, but it's really important. Everything I just said, everything I'm about to say, is still the analysis phase. These are not conclusions. Every now and then in the comments, people misunderstand analysis and think that these are conclusions I'm giving and start arguing these individual points. I'm just looking at behaviors here, trying to see what's going on to form a conclusion. We're not there yet. So here we have a really good example of this if we look at her anger in this interview. So someone who comes into this interview already having decided that she's guilty and only looking for evidence to support that conclusion will say, oh my God, look how angry she is at him because she knows that he got it all right, so it's getting her all worked up. Whereas somebody who's already decided that she's innocent and is only looking for evidence to support that will say, oh my God, look at the way she's confronting him and she's upset at him because it's obviously a false accusation. In reality, anger in and of itself doesn't support either of those two things. We have to take it as a data point along with everything else we're seeing to try to form a conclusion. And really quickly, while we're talking about bias, when it's brought up that a lot of this investigation was not done properly, and there were a lot of missteps, and some of the detectives jumped to conclusions a little too prematurely. A lot of people who are leaning towards this being the parents will say, no, the detectives had a hunch and they were following that hunch, and you know, it was a good hunch. They were right. But if you really look at it, it wasn't the same hunch. Steve Thomas, who we just saw, and Linda Arndt were the two who had hunches in that room. And a lot of people say, oh, they had a hunch. They knew it was the parents. But they didn't think it was the same parent. Steve Thomas thinks that Patsy did it, not John. Linda Arndt thought that John did it. We don't really know what she thought about Patsy, but her intuition said that it was John. So even the detectives were following their gut and thought that the parents were involved, didn't think that it was the same parent who committed this crime. So that's something to think about. Moving along, pretty early in episode 3, they went into this whole thing that happened with a grand jury, which is really, really interesting, but I had a lot of questions about how these things normally go, and I wanted to bring someone to talk to us who really understands the legal aspect of all this. So back by extremely popular demand, I think some of you were getting a little impatient that he hasn't been on the channel for a while. Here is one of my favorite YouTube legal analysts and a very good friend, Rob from Law&Lumber. What's up, bro?
Hey, Spidey, it's been a while. Glad to see you. Glad you brought me a case to talk about.
Yes, sir. I'm really excited to ask you some questions about this because there are things about this that just don't make sense to me, and I'm hoping you can clarify.
I will do my very best.
The grand jurors have done their work extraordinarily well. Yet I must report to you that I and my prosecution task force believe we do not have sufficient evidence to warrant the filing of charges against anyone who has been investigated at this time.
Number of years down the road, 2 sources of mine told me, you can't report this, but they indicted both John and Patsy Ramsey. And multiple grand jurors confirmed for me that's what happened.
The grand jurors didn't know who might have done what, but felt that there was something that happened there.
What they believed was that the parents knew what had happened or should have known what had happened or should have got her help and failed to do so. That's what one grand juror said to me.
Okay, Rob, so I have a lot of questions about all of this. So can you just clarify what's going on here? What is a grand jury? What is their job? What do they do? What happened here? And why did the district attorney decide to say, no, we're not going to pursue that? What's going on?
A grand jury is made up of citizens plucked from the body politic, plucked from the area where you live. And that grand jury sits and presides over cases to determine whether there's facts sufficient to go forward with charges against individuals. In this particular case, a grand jury was impaneled. They sat for 13 months, reviewed 30,000 pieces of evidence, and ultimately were given the option of proceeding with charges. At the conclusion of the investigation, a DA or someone from the DA's office presents the grand jury with a list of charges that they want returned back as indictments. The grand jury sits, they hear the list of charges, and they review all the evidence that they've been considering over the course of the past 13 months. And they make a vote, majority wins, in determining which charges come back as being included in the indictment against this individual. In this particular case, several years after the statement that you just heard, there was a lawsuit filed for the release of certain parts of this grand jury indictment. In response to the lawsuit, what ended up coming to fruition was the production of 4 pages consisting of the 4 counts that the grand jury returned a true bill of indictment on. Now, interestingly, a prosecutor does not have they're not required to proceed with charges after the grand jury returns the indictment. There's a fundamental task of prosecutorial discretion that dictates that the prosecutor can only go forward with charges when they believe that they have enough evidence to prove those charges beyond a reasonable doubt. It is interesting to note that the charges that were brought back were charges 4A and 7, apparently of a list of charges that were presented to the grand jury, both as to John and as to Patsy Ramsey. Charge 4A was that either John or Patsy did unlawfully, knowingly, recklessly, and feloniously permit a child to be unreasonably placed in a situation which posed a threat of injury to the child's life or health. That's one of the charges that came back. The second charge that came back was that John or Patsy did unlawfully, knowingly, and feloniously render assistance to a person with intent to hinder, delay, and prevent the discovery, detention, or apprehension of someone. It's interesting because the charges that did not come back were presumptively charges 1, 2, and 3, which would have been in the first degree, some version of manslaughter, and then some version of reckless homicide or negligent homicide as the third count. In essence, if you were to boil down what the findings meant and what the return of the bill meant on these specific counts, if the grand jury was presented with counts 1, in the first degree, count 2, some version of manslaughter, count 3, some version of negligent homicide, and they determined that there was not enough evidence for probable cause that John or Patsy committed those offenses, it raises some confusion as to how they reached count 4 or count 7. It is almost as if the grand jury was faced with the premise that something had occurred and was looking retroactively to find some element of fault for the people they viewed as being most responsible for the care of JonBenet Ramsey.
Okay, that's really interesting. So I had a thought about this. Let me know if it makes sense. Is it possible that the reason we're seeing this confusing outcome is because they looked at the evidence and said, yeah, there isn't enough here to think beyond reasonable doubt that the parents did this, but because something was off or because of the public opinion, they also weren't okay just letting the parents go completely because they didn't want to say like they're innocent of everything. So that might explain why there's this strange like no to all this, but yes to these odd things. Does that make sense?
I think you're on the right track. Let me see if I can expound a little bit further. So you ever get the gut feeling that something just wasn't right, that something occurred and that someone should be responsible for what occurred? And you find yourself at the end of some tragic event looking backwards and saying, well, who are we going to task with responsibility for what transpired? Something happened, and I can't say for sure that it was this person. However, I have a really bad feeling about this person or this circumstance. And therefore, I think there's at least enough that I want to see more evidence on it.
So how often does a DA look at these indictments and go, no, I'm good?
Not often at all. Here's the thing. The DA is the one who's presenting the case to the grand jury. The DA is the one that's marshaling the evidence in front of the grand jury. The DA is the one who has impaneled the grand jury. The DA is the one who's asking the grand jury to return the charges. Very rarely will a DA get charges back from the grand jury they've been presenting evidence to over the course of 13 months and have the opportunity to proceed with an arrest on 4 different counts and say, no, I don't need to do anything with this.
Do you think that's why he was super respectful in his statement and saying like, they did a really, really good job, but I'm not going to pursue it? So it's kind of like because he didn't want to come out and be like, yeah, I'm just going to ignore everything they did for 13 months, like almost out of a sense of guilt. Do you feel like that's why his statement came out that way?
Absolutely. But let me also ask you this one. Do you think a DA who's a publicly elected official might feel some need to explain themselves to the body politic who elected him and put him in office? I think he might. And honestly, I don't know that he ever really thought that those indictments would ever be unsealed. Grand jury proceedings are historically remarkably secretive. They are routinely sealed, and very rarely does the public get a glimpse into what transpires in the grand jury room.
I told my photographer, key in on Michael Caine's face when the announcement's made. And you could see Michael Caine's lower lip was quivering. It looked like he was really upset.
So, Spidey, it must have been interesting hearing the investigative journalist doing some body language analysis there.
Yeah, it was great. Like when I heard that, I was like, okay, so cool that like she knew from instinct, doing her job for as long as she'd done it, that we were going to see some interesting behavioral analysis in that moment, and tells her cameraman, okay, zoom into Michael Caine, like that guy standing behind the district attorney. But Rob, can you explain to us why she felt that we were going to see something interesting from Michael Caine and who he is and why she felt he'd feel a certain way about this?
I'm really glad you asked that question. So in May of 1998, Alex Hunter, the elected DA, actually went out and hired a special prosecutor. Now, he didn't just hire any special prosecutor. So the DAs are allowed to go out and hire special attorneys that prosecute cases for different reasons. He went out and found Michael Caine specifically because he was a specialist at presenting cases to grand juries. That was the reason he was hired to bring this case before a grand jury.
So now let's look at Michael Caine commenting on this moment, because you have the reporter here who said he looked really upset, that bottom lip was quivering, and in the Netflix documentary, we have Michael Caine commenting on that moment.
There was a lot of disappointment, but it wasn't because of what the grand jury did or didn't do or whatever. It was a disappointment that I'd spent close to 2 years working on this thing and couldn't come to a resolution.
So it seems to me like she did a pretty good job analyzing the nonverbal communication there. And it's such a great example of how analysis should work. She's not jumping to a conclusion, she's just saying it seemed like it was really negative in that moment. And she's right, it was, but we're getting some clarity from him as to why he felt that way. And Rob, do you feel he's entitled to feel that way?
I mean, imagine that you are a special prosecutor brought in for the express purpose that you are a specialist in front of grand juries. You work in front of a grand jury for 13 months, asking them to return a true bill of indictment with your 3 top charges being murder, manslaughter, and some degree of reckless homicide. And this happens. Everything is just not pursued. I would be a little frustrated too.
And then would you slap on top of that the fact that the stuff that did come back in them saying, we'd like to indict on this, the DA just said, nah. Do you think that also contributes or no?
I think there's got to be a little bit of bleed over frustration there. I mean, he was tasked with the presenting of a case to the grand jury. The presenting of the case said, find what charges you can, find what felonies you can. And he came back to the DA and said, look, I didn't get what you wanted, counts 1, 2, and 3, but I have 2 solid counts against each one of these individuals. And the DA says, I can't proceed based on what you gave me. That would feel like a little bit of a slap in the face.
A quivering lip enters. That's
Yeah, I guess you're right.
It's also really interesting that you started by saying the frustration was about how he worked really hard on this, and then the grand jury was just like, yeah, no, we're not going to move forward with this. Because when he's talking about it, he goes, there was a lot of frustration, but it wasn't about what the grand jury did or didn't do in this dismissive manner. What's interesting is the gentleman next to him. The moment he says that, he goes from looking at him and looking straight down, and he's like caressing the table. I don't know if there's something on there or not. It's hard to tell, but he's all of a sudden taking a lot of interest in his hands in the table. I don't think he necessarily buys that Michael Caine didn't feel a certain way towards what the grand jury did in there.
You mean taking a lot of his interest away from the camera that's displaying his reaction? Yeah, I think he was uncomfortable with what was being said right there in that moment.
At this point in the documentary, they went into a list of other suspects or people of interest that seemed to have some kind of connection to this. And there's a lot of gruesome details that I'm going to spare as I try to sum this up. But if you want all the details, you go check out the episode on Netflix. There was also a great article in People magazine that listed all the people that had some kind of connection. So the first one they talked about was a man called Gary Oliva, and he was in Boulder, Colorado at the time. He had a criminal history that was related to crimes of this nature, and apparently around the time that JonBenet's body was found, he called a friend of his and he was distraught. They went to his tent, because he lived in a tent, and found pictures of JonBenet, and after talking to him, he said that he would confess to having done this in exchange of 3 square meals a day and a roof over his head. However, his DNA did not match the DNA found at the crime scene. Next up was Randy Simons, who was a photographer who took pictures of JonBenet as well as other beauty queens, and some of the parents had expressed concerns about some of his behaviors. After the news about JonBenet broke out, he called some of the parents. Apparently he was hysterical, saying, I didn't kill JonBenet, I didn't kill JonBenet, when nobody asked, completely unprompted. But it could be argued that he knew that some of these parents were suspecting him of this kind of behavior, so he was trying to get ahead of it because he thought that, oh my God, people are going to think that I had something to do with this. It can be argued that way, or it could be argued that he had some kind of guilty knowledge. Very confusing. Eventually, down the line, Randy was caught with explicit content involving children on his computer, for which he was arrested. But much like Gary Oliva, his DNA did not match the DNA that was found at the scene. Finally, they talk about a man by the name of John Brewer Eustace, who had previously committed a similar crime involving a break-in and the kidnapping of a little girl, and they found a shrine of JonBenet Ramsey at his house. But he had a rock-solid alibi for the night that this happened. I want to ask you, so some of this seems really interesting. Some of this to me seems like, okay, well, we have a guy here who is confessing. Sure, it's because he wants a square meal and a roof over his head, but he also has pictures of JonBenet and he has previous activity along these lines. So why isn't anyone, going after individuals like this? Why isn't this going to trial?
Well, the challenge that you have is similar to the challenge that the grand jury faced and the prosecutor faced at the grand jury returned the indictments on John and Patsy. The threshold or the burden that the prosecutor has is the prosecutor has to believe that they can prove a case beyond a reasonable doubt. In the one case that you mentioned where the individual said that he had admitted doing this, right? He wanted 3 square meals a day. They did comparative DNA analysis in that particular case. If I'm a prosecutor and I'm faced with all of these different statements where the person has admitted to the crime, there's other evidence tangentially related that places him at or near the scene, but it's all circumstantial. And I have a DNA non-match or DNA does not match. I don't believe that I can prove a case beyond a reasonable doubt sufficient that I'm going to bring charges on that case.
So interestingly, a confession doesn't hold the weight that some people might think it does. Because I mean, in this case, he traded it for comforts. So already that's kind of weird. And it seems like the DNA didn't match. So I guess there's like a pecking order, right? So I guess the DNA not matching weighs more than someone confessing.
Prosecutor has to look at the case as a whole. They have to look at the case they have to present to a jury to get a conviction beyond a reasonable doubt. They have to believe that they can prove that case beyond a reasonable doubt. And every single crack in the case, whether it be an alibi, someone saw them at a different location that night, whether it be the DNA, every one of the cracks in that evidentiary chain or every one of the cracks in the case that they have might be persuasive against the prosecutor bringing the charges before a jury.
So Rob, this is a bit of a different collaboration because that was like all the legal stuff there. And now I'm going to look at some other behavioral stuff. And I know you just want to jump in here and talk about this stuff, but I'm glad we did because I had a lot of questions and they're all answered. So thanks so much for your time. And yeah.
Of course, always happy to be here. Love talking with you and can't wait to see the rest of your analysis on this one.
In 2002, I was contacted by someone who knew my work on the Ramsey case and wanted to talk. His email name was Daxis. Started to email me on a regular basis, where he slowly started to say that he had JonBenet. We taped, I believe, about 11 hours of conversation, all of which have been listened in on by various intelligence agencies. And that was a very, very dark experience. Worst part for me was I had to pretend it was all okay. I couldn't be judgmental. The conversations, I went back home and I just started to sob.
Okay, so the man we're hearing from there is Michael Tracy, and he had produced several documentaries about this case. And he was very outspoken about the fact that he felt the Ramseys were innocent through his research and investigations. And at some point, he got emails from this man who called himself Daxis. Now, I'm not going to share what was in these emails or in these phone conversations because it's not important for what I need to talk about, and they're really, really awful and disturbing. But what I want to talk about is at some point there where he says that the hardest part for him was to pretend like it was all okay and that he couldn't be judgmental. And that is such a great lesson that we have to talk about. So on the channel, I have a video where I share with you 4 tips that interrogators and interviewers use to get people to open up. And there's an acronym, which is OPEN, O-P-E-N, and N stands for non-judgmental, which was really great to hear him say that I couldn't be judgmental. Now, I'll leave a link in the description if you want to check out that whole video and learn the entire system of getting people to open up. But in a nutshell, when we talk about non-judgmental, it's the fact that interviewers and interrogators know that no matter what someone confesses to, it could be the most horrible thing, you go, okay, that I understand, things got out of hand, what happened next? So you handle it very calmly in order for them, because they're testing the waters. And when they see that they're not being judged, they feel like they can open up a little bit more, and that's how confessions happen. So it's really great that in this case, he sat there and corresponded with this person and talked to this person for a really long time and just had to pretend like, no, it's all good, there's nothing wrong with this. And let's see where that led. Let's see what the fruits of that labor was.
I now know that person to be John Mark Carr.
Carr worked as a substitute teacher at Hamilton Elementary for a few months just before JonBenet's murder, but he was taken off the substitute list after complaints from parents.
In 2001, he was arrested in Petaluma, California. He'd been working there as a teacher, and he was found with child pornography. He was charged, was heading for trial, and he left the country. and disappeared.
So it turns out that Daxis was a man called John Mark Carr, and he kept corresponding with Michael Tracy until eventually he asked for a photograph of JonBenet, and it was sent to a P.O. box in Bangkok where he was arrested. And after that, he pretty much confessed to everything. He said that he was in their house throughout the night. He talked about the ransom note. He even talked about how he initially wanted to address it to both parents, but then he changed his mind. He talked about this relationship that he had with JonBenet, and interestingly enough, he also knew something that wasn't public information. He knew the nickname that JonBenet had for her grandmother.
Carr blurted out, quote, "Everybody says I couldn't know my way around the house, but I got in the house around 5 o'clock and I stayed there all night. They didn't come back until 10 o'clock.
But just like every other suspect up until this point, his DNA did not match the DNA that was recovered at the crime scene. So let's talk about the DNA in this case.
The DNA in this case has been problematic from the beginning, many experts have told me, and this goes back to the contamination of the crime scene.
Well, I think there's a problem with the DNA. I think if the DNA is faulty, a lot of people could still be a suspect.
You know, the reporting done by guys like Charlie Brennan, who say that the DNA in the case isn't as valuable or significant as we think. We've been ruling people out for the wrong reasons. The police have never ruled out John and Patsy Ramsey based solely on this DNA. So how do you rule anybody out based solely on this DNA? You have to sort the DNA we have today and make more sense of it.
Okay, so the man we heard from at the end is John Andrew Ramsey, John Ramsey's son. And he brings up a good point. A lot of investigators that looked into this determined that the DNA might not be reliable in this case. And a lot of people in the public use that as an excuse to say, well, see, the parents could still be the ones who did this. So what he's saying is that if the unreliability of the DNA puts the parents back on the table, it puts a whole bunch of other people back on the table as well. And it's a good point. Now, I'm not defending the parents. I'm not defending these other people. I'm just defending sound reasoning and critical thinking. I've seen some comments on social media that will say, no, it can't be any of these other people. The DNA ruled them out, but we'll continue to suspect the parents. Or vice versa. People who will say the DNA already ruled out the parents, but will continue to suspect these other people. The DNA is either reliable or it isn't. If it is reliable, it can't be any of these people. If it isn't reliable, it could be any one of these people.
What we're advocating for, and we have been doing so for the last year or so, aggressively, is we know there's 5 or 6 items that were taken from the crime scene, sent into a lab for DNA sampling, and were not sampled. So we want those items sampled. And then use the public genealogy database to look for not only a match, but a similar relative.
Okay, finally back to some behavioral analysis. Sorry, we had to talk about some other details of the case to get to this point. But here we have John Ramsey talking about the fact that for a while now, for a year or so, he's been advocating aggressively for there to be more DNA testing done. Now, what's really interesting is that in the beginning, when he says, what we're really advocating for, and we've been doing so for a year aggressively, as he says aggressively, we see an eyebrow flash. Those eyebrows go up as he's saying aggressively. And there's a ton of research on the eyebrow flash. This is a gesture that we see everywhere in the world, and there's a couple of reasons it might happen, but they all come down to the same thing, and that's giving importance to something. We are very expressive with our eyebrows socially, and you could see the eyebrows from a very far distance. So we often use them to indicate what's important. And research has shown that in conversation, just before, milliseconds before we say something really important, we see those eyebrows go up. It indicates, now this is important. So here he's putting that emphasis on aggressively, because he's on Netflix and he knows that millions of people are going to watch this documentary, and he wants all of them to know that he's been aggressively pursuing this DNA being looked into. I think this is perception management, because he knows that a lot of people suspect he had something to do with this, and he knows that it's a good look, that he wants this DNA to be tested, right? Because a guilty party might distance from that, make excuses, not push it so much. He wants the viewers to know that he's totally fine with this, and he's pursuing it, not just pursuing it, but aggressively. Like, listen to me, all the skeptics out there, I really want this DNA test to happen. Ultimately, if he's really out there pushing for this to happen, and in the documentary they shared that the police department in Boulder was asked to do this, and they're being pretty secretive as to whether it's being done or not, but if he's actually advocating for that, it's a good look. The fact that he's pushing that even 28 years later, he wants this to be tested, he wants to find out, it's an extra step that he's taking for this to get solved. And if that's true, if that's happening, it's a good look.
I told Patsy it's okay, if you go home. And she did. And I went outside and just I don't know. And I realized I needed to tell Burke. So I woke him up. He said, it's Mom. And I said, yeah. She's gone. That was hard.
So there we have John Ramsey talking about the passing of Patsy in 2006. And when I saw this, something immediately struck me. And it's the fact that we're seeing a lot of sadness here. Like, we're seeing him look down, his voice is quivering. We see that droopiness of the face a little bit. So we're seeing indicators of sadness. It's not this big, like, breaking down into tears thing, but there's certainly sadness there. Even like the pace at which he's telling it and the pauses, and he stops, and there's even that little bit of a pacifier or adapter on the forehead. There's something we do to adapt to stress or anxiety or negative feelings. So we're seeing all these things that are negative. And the thing I noted about it is that we've heard him talk about JonBenet in this documentary quite a few times, and it's not this. Usually he tells the story pretty neutral. As he reminisces, he might even smile a little bit. It's not overly emotional in either direction. It has a neutrality to it. So when this happened, I asked myself, why am I seeing a lot of sadness about this, but not the same amount, or I don't see so much of this when he talks about JonBenet? And I have a couple of theories. One theory might be that he's simply desensitized. For over 25 years, he's told the story of JonBenet again and again and again. And he does documentaries, and he does interviews, and he does all. So he's told the story again and again to the point where it's become just a story that he could tell. Now, I would imagine that any parent who lived this kind of thing would be sad about it for the rest of their lives. I'm not saying that he's overly joyous about this story, but maybe throughout the years, he's come to a point where he could tell it without breaking down at any point. The second reason that I thought it might be is that when it comes to Patsy, he actually lived it. He saw it. He saw that slow deterioration. He was there when it happened. Whereas with JonBenet, he wasn't there. According to his story, is that, he wasn't there, it happened throughout the night, and he found the body, which in and of itself is very sad, but he didn't witness the actual passing. Now, some might argue that the not knowing is even worse than the knowing, but that might have to do something with it. They say out of sight, out of mind. If I don't see it, if I don't witness it, I may not think about it the same way. So maybe there's an element of that. And now I'm going to give the possibilities 3 and 4, which are opposites. And please realize we're still in the analysis phase. These are just hypotheses. These aren't conclusions, so don't hit me back on this. They're just possibilities. So the third possibility is that he simply has more of an emotional attachment to Patsy than he did to JonBenet. It's a possibility. Don't fight me on it. I'm just saying it's possible, and that would explain why he's more emotional towards one than the other. I'm sure you could find counterexamples to that. I'm just saying it might explain that discrepancy. And then the fourth reason, which is kind of going the complete opposite direction of the third one, is that he feels partially responsible for what happened to Patsy, because he made the difficult decision to stop the treatment, and he wasn't completely upfront with her about it. He talks about it in the documentary, and I have some questions about that. I mean, he talks about his reasoning, but I still found that I'd have a couple of questions about that. But regardless, it might be because he feels like he had something to do with her death, which in turn might mean that he doesn't feel a responsibility towards what happened to JonBenet. He can detach from a sense of responsibility. Again, these are just theories. So I was going through all these theories and trying to think about why we might see this discrepancy, because there are a lot of reasons we might. Some of them even contradict each other, as you just saw. But towards the end of the documentary, he actually addressed it.
A friend of Beth, my oldest daughter, at Beth's funeral came up to me and said, Mr. Ramsey, if I died, I would not want my parents to be sad. That was a real meaningful comment to me. Our minister in Atlanta said, look, at first memories are going to bring pain, but eventually they'll bring joy. And I found that to be true. It takes a while, it takes a long while for the pain to go away. But then the memory of JonBenet is joyful. And
that's where you're at now.
That's where I'm at now.
Okay, so he's talking about how a friend of his other daughter who passed told him that if something like that happened to her, she wouldn't want her parents to be sad. And then he talks about how the minister also talked about how eventually you get past the sad and go over to the happy. Now keep in mind, this is a religious man. So he has some beliefs pertaining to where JonBenet is now and what she wants for him. And she even talks about it, says, you know, she doesn't want me to be sad. So whereas earlier I described it as desensitized out of retelling it and retelling it, there's a new element here, which is not desensitized, but a shift of perspective, where in time, he just focuses on the positive. And we're seeing here towards the end a little bit more of that sad communication. His tone is dropped, the voice is quivering a little, we're seeing a bit of that droopiness on the face. It's looking a little more like when he was talking about Patsy. And then at the end, as he's saying, the memory of JonBenet is joyful, and that's where I'm at now. And just before that's where I'm at now, there's a pause where we see the hands come up like this, and the mouth thins out and raises just a little bit.
And
that's where you're at now.
That's where I'm at now.
So this constitutes a shrug. A shrug is any combination of the eyebrows, the mouth, the shoulders, the hands, and sometimes even a head tilt that go like this. Any combination of those. So the research on shrugging tells us that it's a disengagement, a lack of something. I don't something. And the shrug that we're seeing there falls under the category of an epistemic shrug. It's basically someone saying, I don't know what to tell you. So, you know, it's hard and it takes a while, and eventually it turned into a more positive thing, and I could focus on the positive, and I don't know what to tell you. That's where I'm at now. So here's offering an answer to the question that I had. He's saying that in time, he focused more on the positive. And is it truthful? Is it deceptive? I could tell you that in this clip, in a documentary that's directed, there doesn't seem to be an obvious cluster that would make me question that. He's talking about his journey, he's talking about his process, and behaviorally, there isn't really this big red flag that makes me want to ask more questions. But this is such a really great example of how if somebody comes into this story with a bias, regardless of which way that bias goes, this statement could be interpreted two different ways. So someone who's already decided that the Ramseys are guilty, 100%, they refuse to hear any other evidence, will look at this and go, oh my God, look at the way he has no emotions when he talks about her, he's obviously guilty, because they're only looking for evidence to support that. On the other hand, someone who's already decided that the Ramseys are innocent, there's no question about it, there's no reason to question them, will say, oh, look at how he's not overselling his sadness, right? We've seen so many people before try to oversell how sad they are. He went through his sadness, now he's in a place where he could think about it positively, and he's not trying to oversell this sadness, even in a documentary. So it's so funny how if someone's stuck in a bias, this could be seen in two completely different ways. Whereas the very reasonable way to look at this is that his lack of sadness here is not an indication of innocence or guilt. It just is what it is. Not everything has to be forced into a narrative. And I think that's such a great conclusion for this entire case. We talked about the challenges of analyzing behaviors in a documentary that's directed 20 years after the fact by someone who's told this story thousands of times. The behaviors just aren't reliable. And I'm very sorry. I wish I could give you more. I really wish I could sit here and go, oh yeah, behaviors always tell us who's guilty and who's innocent, and here you could see this and that, so obviously he did it or he didn't do it. But I can't do that. Regular viewers of my channel know that there have been a lot of cases where I had a very high confident read, and I was open about that. I said, because of this, I'm very confident that these behaviors indicate that this is probably what's going on. I never say definitely, but I feel very confident about that. But by that same token, I have to be honest when it's a low confident read. And when it comes to this story, there's just too much that doesn't add up any direction that you explore. And I think it's very, very foolish for anyone to approach this with any amount of certainty. Look, not just in the public, but within professional investigators, there's disagreement. There are very competent and professional investigators who think the Ramseys were involved, and very competent and professional investigators who think that the Ramseys were not involved. Basically, in every field you could think of that looks into things like this, there's disagreement, and with good reason. So I think this is just one of those cases where the sensible thing to do is to say, we don't have enough information, and the one thing we can all agree on is how sad what happened to that little girl is, because we all do agree on that. As for me, behaviorally, I'll tell you a few things that I do have a bit more confidence in. I said in the last video, I said it here as well, there seems to be a synergy with John and Patsy. Even now, years after she's passed on, he still defends her. And even in all the interviews, there was this togetherness. Because of this, I personally am leaning towards the fact that either both did it or both didn't do it. I don't personally subscribe to the theories that one did it without the knowledge or the involvement of the other. Because of this synergy that we're seeing, the fact that they're never suspecting each other, you know, I've seen this kind of thing before to where one parent may have done it and the other didn't really know. So you see this kind of, you know, not really sure, bit of skepticism. They seem to be together on this from day one. I also believe, based on the behaviors of this documentary alone, that John Ramsey genuinely is all for more DNA testing. And it seems, at the very least, again, on this documentary, that he's not too worried about what that DNA will uncover. Take that for what it's worth. With that said, the area where I would have the most questions for John and Patsy, if she were still around, would be specifically that ransom note. There are things in the way they tell the story, there are things about the behaviors around the ransom note that are just different from the way they tell other stories. There's a bit more evasiveness, there's a bit more things that aren't clarified. The fact that, you know, they read it and there was some threats that said if you call anyone, you know, whether it's your friends, whether it's the police, we're gonna do horrible things to your daughter, and they immediately called the police and their friends. And they didn't request subtlety and say, maybe we should be subtle about this. They had like a whole bunch of people come over. I have a lot of questions about that. But then if we go down the path of them being involved in this, there are a lot of valid counter arguments. For one thing, the DNA, and we can argue back and forth about DNA all day, but the DNA does rule out members of the Ramsey family. Then there's the fact that a grand jury sat there for 13 months, looked at all this evidence and said, no, we can't, beyond a reasonable doubt, assume that they did this. So that's a valid data point. There's also the fact that people tend to forget we're looking for a monster here. The way that this was done, the details of how this was done is horrifying. This wasn't an accident. This was vicious. So it's a big accusation to say not just that these people are capable of but of these monstrous acts and then hiding it for 20 years. Not saying it's impossible, it's a really big accusation though. So again, all this to say, no matter which direction we go, there are things that just don't add up, there are too many question marks, and I think the only sound conclusion is we just can't know. And I'm sorry if sometimes I look at something where there isn't enough information, I just have to be honest about that and tell you what I do see, but that it doesn't lead to a conclusion with any amount of confidence. So let's have those open conversations because they're really fascinating. And for every argument, there are very valid counter arguments. And I'm not a big fan of shutting someone down just because they don't put importance where we think importance should be. Everything is important in this case, and we can have those conversations. So let me know which way you're leaning. That said, I hope you all had a wonderful holiday season and that you will have a wonderful new year. A lot of big things coming for me in 2025. I mentioned some of them, but as the dates come closer, I'll give you guys more news. But I hope you guys have just the best start of the year, and I will see you on the next one.